rectangular. In any event, to my immediate left is Lillian Allen. She's a dub poetry practitioner. Chet Singh, who is also a practitioner. Maria Casas, who is a critic or an academic. And Michael St. George, who is also a dub poet. So what I'm going to do is, since dub poetry came out of, the African, Jamaican, Caribbean aesthetic, and in terms of the Caribbean culture, we usually defer to our elders. And Lillian Allen is an elder in more ways than one. And so I'm going to ask her to begin first. Lillian Allen, if you don't have her biography, is a founding dub poetry pioneer, birth mother of dub poetry in Canada, and she has, and still is doing it, embarks on tours of university campus, most recently doing dub poetry in English departments. So I'd like Lillian to talk to what she sees happening in the various English department, cultural studies department, with regards to the spoken word, and why people in those departments think that dub poetry is a worthwhile practice to bring to the university.
Okay, thank you. I always say thanks to the praise, but give me the raise.
Okay.
Well, I want to talk about a few things, and that's one thing I learned with dealing with media, that you got to say what you want to say, no matter what they ask you, once you get the mic. So, first of all, it's an honor to be here with my colleagues and friends, you guys, so Clive and you folks, so forth. Actually, how much time do I have? 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
Yeah. More like 7.
Well, I wanted to start out because a Black Music Conference, and trying to position where dub poetry is, because we have fought for dub poetry to be this literary genre, is to just have a little consideration or dialogue around why we think it's important to be here. I do have a poem that talks about the birth of reggae music, but more importantly about the way I think the universe renews itself through the music of Black folks. But before I read that poem, I have to say that in terms of Black culture as opposed to Euroculture, we don't see this stuff in a binary way, and I mean Black culture closer to the community roots, in a binary way, in black and white, and that in fact there's a spectrum to everything, more in terms of how Native people see their stuff. So that when we're talking about poetry, we don't think one thing is poetry and the other isn't. Like Braithwaite is poetry, and Bob Marley isn't. Some academics might get into that. But what is central to poetry is the language, as opposed to what's central to music is the music, right? So I think it shifts when you get the language, and language doesn't have to mean words. I have a poem that said, language is not just grammar, language is not just the English language, you're a young language, So it's not word, but it's the language and what the language intends to do. So that's where I would place dub poetry, poetics. The other thing about dub poetry, especially in the Caribbean context, in the Caribbean diaspora context, is that in the Caribbean, the culture that we are accustomed to validating, acknowledging, and being guided by is usually the culture of the middle class or the upper middle class, or remnants of the colonial culture. So that with the advent of reggae music and its struggle to get airplay, and I always say when I was growing up, reggae wasn't played on the radio, we were seeing for the first time where, community people, working class culture is now becoming the main culture of the people. And I don't think you have seen that anywhere in history. You've seen aspects of it where a practitioner or writer who's been trained or educated or is, special in Irish literature in various forms, early English literature. Those folks have sort of emerged and reflected the realities of the community and working class people. But I think it's the first time in history you actually see people en masse, not just one or two, articulating their experiences and communicating with, dialoguing with their visions and what they need to do. So that's how I definitely distinguish not just dub poetry, but the movement that continued into hip hop and what we're experiencing in the transformation in North American popular culture. Of course, I get co-opted because every advertising agency sees it as a marketing opportunity, but today's not the day to go into that. Dub poetry itself remained an artistic-driven form as opposed to a market-driven form. Sure, we would like to make some money and be sold, but if we had to do something that somebody wanted us to do, or a producer, and I've been approached by producers who, do this track for me and just say it this way or whatever, or in the early stages, a couple of record companies said we have to be able to market you. And I said, what does that mean? Lose a few pounds, put on lipstick, whatever. I'm over that now, but it was, and it's like, I don't see a dub poet doing that. I mean, we're doing art. We're doing something that's so close to our soul, and something that we have to do to survive, to live our lives. It's part of the way we live our lives. In dub poetry is embodied our values, because we're artists and we consider ourselves revolutionary. I mean, let's not get away from it. I haven't seen a dub poet who is wishy-washy. Not anybody has made it, really. And those elements are embodied in the poetry itself. The notions of community building, you get it in the texture, the tempo of it, the asserting new possibilities, and so on and so forth. I think that's different from even the literary development that we have seen in Canada, where that has been a site of feud and competition and so on, that in fact the dub poets themselves are a pretty, I would have to say, loving group and pretty kind to each other and see ourselves in collectivity. So I just want to make sure that that kind of information is out there. The other important thing to dub poetry is that it has been a major point of access for the community, for black folks. And that where the poetry has proceeded and it's gained, made relationships or gained recognition or importance, that in my particular case and in the other case of the other folks, Chet, who works in anti-racism in Clifton, we have made it also a collective effort. So this conference, for example, is an example, we actually got ourselves here. But we didn't see it as something to come and talk individually. We saw it as a point of access. So we don't see it as performance. We don't see what we do as just performance or even singularly art where people come and interact with. We see it as a point of access, somewhere to get in to what's happening, to get into the process, and to have some kind of a political or textural or some kind of influence on it, to change the course of how things are. Somebody might talk, I hope somebody talk about how dub poetry emerged in black Canadian cultural consciousness and how kept it alive when nothing was good, both the cultural and the political consciousness. For a number of years, it was a lull in the community, and there are a few of us who kept saying, we have to do this. Even though we were tired and it was time to go home and sleep, we said, we have to do this till the political movements, till other people come up. Like, we have to hold it together, literally. They say with spit and tape. We were holding it together and going out and doing the stuff. Although we didn't want to do it, it was wrecking our personal lives, but we knew it was important to do it because we knew that the movement would come up again, and that then we could relax. Mm-hmm. So when other people started emerging and taking on the stuff, Michael in that case, Afua was there, but when she started to come up some more, then people like myself and Clifton, could sort of relax and get on with other aspects of our lives. So, just a brief thing about what's happening now. I'm being invited to a number of universities in the States. I've always been invited sort of to a number of conferences internationally and so on, but there seemed to be a thing in the States now and here to a certain extent where the English departments and some other departments, everything is coming together now, the push for diversity, etc. People are trying to find a way to unite the realities of the students with what the academy is about and what they're teaching in terms of whether it's a canon or whether it's a range of work from diverse communities. Because what they're finding is that language is so central to who people are and what they're doing. And although people aren't like speaking the dub language, what they're doing is very similar. They're basically creating a different kind of reality and a different relationship to knowledge. So they're using what I do in dub poetry as a way to look at that and as a way to see how it can form that bridge in terms of students. No longer that poetry or stuff isn't important. It isn't carrying the ideas. In fact, some of the work that we do, the ideas in there are as complex as anything in any kind of university literary academic philosophy text that you can find. So that's where it's at now, and with the added texture of tempo and life and all of that. It's definitely capturing the imagination, and not just the students, but the teachers. So that's definitely on the rise. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about orality. I mean, it's been looked at as that. And I know Maria has some to do a development on that, modalities. So I just have to say that I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see that this so-called oral spoken literature that people usually associate with lower class and not good, etc., is now being seen as a very central and important factor in the academic context, building knowledge, articulating things, etc. And also, as people are looking at their own lives and developing the dimensions, then this is something that adds the other levels of knowledge and knowing and so forth. So maybe I should leave it there for now, and then we can get back, right, and I'll do that point.
Good. Thanks, Lillian. Along that line, why don't we just pick up with Maria?
Yeah.
Since,
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay.
The whole orality aspect and the new modality.
Sure. I completed my PhD thesis on orality and writing in the poetry of Lillian Allen and Dion Brand. And the day of my defense, I got a call, long distance to London. Well, my husband, U of T didn't call me in London, but my husband says, hey, U of T wants you to teach a course. And when I went in, I said, what do you want me to teach? And they said, well, the course is called Topics in Canadian Literature. And so I said, well, what kind of topic? Teach your thesis. So I tried to design a course which I taught this winter called Orality in Canadian Literature. And of course I had Dion and Lillian right up front, right at the beginning. And Lillian came in And she came in about a month into the course, and what I was trying to do, first of all, to step back a bit, what I was trying to do with the course was precisely the kinds of things that Lillian just talked about. Trying to, even for undergraduate students, trying to open up the canon, trying to say, look, a literary text isn't necessarily written. A literary text may be song lyrics. A literary text may be sound. It may be performed. A literary text may be very definitely not just non-European, but it may be something like an Inuit myth or a Haida tale that's been transcribed 100 years ago and re-edited and perhaps appropriated, but all of those things can be considered in an English classroom. And I have to say, what went over best was the demonstration of that in the tapes and the performances that I managed to get into the classroom. So that when Lillian came in, I talked about her book first, and then Lillian performed performed some of her poetry for the second hour. And it was just, the difference was tangible and almost unarticulatable. It was something I could talk about but not really get across in any way at all. I brought in Robert Munch, for example, towards the end of who's a children's writer. I'm sure you've heard of him, but he's also a fantastic storyteller, and you catch him on tape, and there's no comparison, And yet, what I could teach was the similarities in the techniques, the repetition. As Lillian said, the emphasis is on language, so we have to find a way of thinking about language that's not anchored in the traditions of literature, which were developed to talk about written language, and so cannot really describe or take in performed language or even language that's been transcribed. So those are the things I tried to get across. I mentioned Motion, and I didn't quite get a tape of Motion in. I tried to get her in, and it fell through. Motion Brathwaite is a hip-hop artist. She's going to be, she's here, I suppose, at this conference. And my students were eager to make a connection between hip-hop and dub and Lillian's work. They loved the material right across the board. They were eager to make connections into their own lives. They could easily see them. And it just basically, because of the logics of pop culture, of where English studies is today as a discipline, of what's happening in dub, precisely in dub, it flowed together very well in the classroom. Now, what Lillian said about dub being, and this is my last remark, about dub being a point of access for dub poets is from the point of view of dub poets, possibly very true. But from my point of view, as a graduate student in the mid-'90s, coming to this basically through the more high literary black Canadian literature of Dion Brand. To me, it was a point of access to black culture and to a black aesthetic, African, I guess I should say, and so I think actually dub works as a bridge rather than an access. It works as a bridge because it's completely accessible, and I saw that all over again in the classroom this year. And it's I think the ethic is an open accessibility, welcoming. Think about this. It's important. There's work to do in the world, and you're part of it. I think that's a large part of the appeal, the ethic, and the aesthetic of dub.
Thanks, Maria. What we're going to do is to continue with the other speakers, and then we go until 10:30. Leslie, is that it? And then open it up for some discussion. So I guess we have 30 minutes left. So Chet, last night I saw you in a very riveting performance at the Bodies in Bad Times. It was wonderful with your band Dub Trinity. What do you have to say?
Well, let me pick up on. Well, first, what I want to start off with is what's my connection to dub poetry. I mean, I'm South Asian. Hopefully you would have noticed that. I mean, one cannot claim racial purity if you come from the Caribbean to begin with, you know? They'd like to think that happens, but anyway. So what is someone like myself doing dub poetry? And, you know, that is something I have to ask myself, because, you know, coming from the Caribbean, I was born in Jamaica, by the way, and that's my connection. You know, as a young kid, I'm Jamaican to begin with. Lillian was talking about destabilizing consciousness and people, and oftentimes when people look at me, they don't assume I'm from Jamaica. You know, you must be from Trinidad or Guyana or maybe India. Chet Singh, right? And maybe you're from the Punjab as well. But no, I was born in Jamaica and I lived in a lot of Caribbean islands. And as a youth growing up, you know, you can't help but notice in Jamaica, it's not like Canada, you know, it's very polarized, class-based, race, gender-based society. You don't have that kind of a middle class. You're either well off or you're very poor. I mean, that's just the disparity. And as a person growing up, you can't help but notice that. And so you look for answers, you know, if you're conscious about these things. And, you know, who did I see on TV? I saw Miss Lou. Miss Lou had a show. I don't know if you guys ever make around it. It was sort of like Sesame Street.
Is it the Ring Ding? Ring Ding with the kids?
Ring Ding, that's right, yeah. And so, you know, you're looking at Miss Lou, and who are your heroes? Because you're trying to make sense of the society you're living in. I mean, I didn't have, like, pop star posters and that. Che Guevara appealed to me. I mean, problematic as he might be, you know, as we revisit.